Hello, my name is Stu Grubb. I'm a hydrogeologist with Emmons and Olivia Resources in St. Paul. The talk today is on getting groundwater management into watershed plans. The inspiration for this talk came from several conversations I had with watershed district administrators and managers wanting to know about groundwater resources in their district and how they may get involved with monitoring and managing them. I had a sense that they understood that groundwater was important and that it was critical to understand groundwater in order to manage the surface water, but they didn't really know how to get started. Some of the questions we'll be answering today are, where do watershed districts fit into groundwater governance? What do you need to get started? And what are some practical low-cost action items for watershed management plans? So this is going to be a very low-tech and practical discussion. If you're looking for information on the latest field measurement and equipment or high-tech graphics from computer models, you're not going to find it here. We're going to focus more on things that you can do in the short term to get groundwater management into your watershed management plan. As you probably know, water governance in Minnesota is split among many state and local agencies. And groundwater governance can be even more complicated because there's even more players involved. So we have the state agencies, including the Department of Natural Resources, the Pollution Control Agency, the Board of Water and Soil Resources, the Minnesota Department of Health, and the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. And then also we have agencies like the Minnesota Geological Survey that do studies on geology and groundwater throughout the state. We also have regional agencies, including the Met Council and watershed districts. Then counties are involved from the health department standpoint and drinking water, as are the cities and local water suppliers. So where do watershed districts fit into all this? Well, probably not in the area of drinking water quality. As I said, that's the Minnesota Department of Health and some of the county agencies. Also, not groundwater pollution. The Pollution Control Agency monitors groundwater pollution and remediation, and they have a long history and well-developed methods of doing that. Probably not going to be groundwater supply. The DNR keeps track of groundwater supply through their groundwater appropriations permit process. Places that watershed districts can fit in are to monitor groundwater on a watershed scale and over longer periods of time to protect specific groundwater dependent natural resources, and also to become an expert in groundwater and surface water interactions, which have a big influence on watershed management. So the first thing you really need to do to get started is to collect as much information as you can about your watershed. A good place to start is with the County Geologic Atlas program. This is run by the Minnesota Geological Survey and the DNR. Not all county geologic atlases are completed. As you can see in the map there, mostly the center part of the state is largely done. Some of the outlying areas are still to be completed. The atlas is divided into two parts. Part A is the geologic report done by the Minnesota Geological Survey, and Part B is the groundwater report that's done by the Department of Natural Resources. A second source of information is the groundwater restoration and protection strategies reports. These are completed in conjunction with the One Watershed, One Plan reports that have been going on for the last several years. Again, as you can see, not all parts of the state have GRAPS reports, but the ones that do, they have an excellent source of information. These are usually done on the Huck 8 watershed scale. So again, probably larger than a typical watershed district, but still good background information. Another important source of information are DNR observation wells. The DNR runs the Cooperative Groundwater Monitoring Program. This is a collection of observation wells that are monitored on a regular basis. Most of them are equipped now with data loggers that will record water levels on an hourly basis. So a very good source of information on groundwater levels over time. Some other sources of information that you should be aware of are Minnesota Geological Survey statewide geology maps and reports. If you're in the metro area, they have regional groundwater flow models, and Met Council has a number of planning documents, particularly related to water supply. There are source water or wellhead protection plans for municipal water supplies throughout the state. Each municipal water supply is required to produce a source water protection plan. So that would include both information on the aquifers and the geology in the area, and also groundwater flow models to determine where the source is for public water supplies. Then there are also miscellaneous investigations for pollution remediation, well advisory areas, and scientific studies that may have occurred in your watershed district. So where do these information sources fall short? Well, they're usually at the wrong scale. As I mentioned, many of them are usually too large for watershed planning. Good background information, but they can be refined. They also don't track changes in groundwater over time. We usually recommend that watershed districts do an inventory of their groundwater dependent natural resources. These include springs, cold water streams, fens, bogs, and other wetland communities. They can also include high quality lakes, particularly those that have a low trophic index. And then most of these groundwater dependent natural resources are associated with areas where groundwater is discharging. So the recharge areas to groundwater can also be very important. You need to have good recharge areas that are not covered with impervious surfaces so that you have infiltration that eventually leads to discharge areas. On the left is a map of northern Washington County and groundwater dependent natural resources that have been mapped there. Over on the east side, we see a string of blue dots that represent the springs that have been mapped along the bluffs of the St. Croix River. There's a few other springs to the west that have also been mapped. The green lines over to the east mark the cold water springs. These are typically trout habitat springs, very unusual and very rare. Then the red areas are wetlands that have particular plant communities that are typically associated with groundwater inflow. We'll discuss a couple of actions that we've recommended to watershed districts, particularly to measure groundwater levels, at least on an annual basis. And this would be in residential wells, industrial wells, as well as irrigation wells or golf course wells. We also have programs where we install shallow piezometers, either in streams or in lakes or even in wetlands. These are both low-cost programs, costing generally less than $8,000 a year that can fit into many watershed district budgets. To give an example of these programs, we can look at Browns Creek Watershed District, where we have been measuring groundwater levels for almost 20 years now. We first measured them in 2002 and have been measuring them on an annual basis since about 2012. The Browns Creek Watershed District Monitoring Network includes 3 DNR observation wells, 16 residential wells, 11 golf course wells, and 1 municipal well. The map here shows the location of these different wells throughout the watershed district. You can see they're scattered around to cover most areas in the watershed district. And each color represents a different aquifer that's being monitored by the different wells. So what kind of information do we get from the monitoring well network? Well, if we look at a couple of DNR observation wells and the records that we have over time, we see some important things that come out of the data. The top line there is a graph of the water level recorded in one of the wells completed in the Prairie du Chien aquifer. In this well, we see that water levels were relatively high in the early 2000s, came down and dipped almost 12 feet in around 2010. And then since then have risen back to actually go higher than their previous high recordings. This kind of fluctuation can have a lot of consequences for watershed management. First of all, it affects water levels in lakes. It affects the base flows into streams, and can also have big influence on things such as infiltration basins that for stormwater that eventually reach groundwater. Looking at the bottom line, we see a lot less variation over time. This is from another well in the Watershed District, a DNR observation well that is closer to Browns Creek and therefore more influenced by the surface water. The point of showing these two graphs is that you can have very different groundwater conditions in different parts of the watershed. Therefore, you need to monitor multiple points within the watershed district so that you get a good picture of groundwater throughout the entire area. Another example of how this data has been used is by looking at Kimbrough Basin flooding. Kimbrough Basin is a small landlocked area within Browns Creek watershed that has recently experienced flooding, which has led to road closures. The roads have been temporarily raised by adding gravel and new asphalt, but the Watershed District is working on a long-term solution along with the county and others. And to do this, we need to understand the role that groundwater plays in this flooding. The nearest observation wells were over 2 miles away, so they weren't really going to provide good groundwater information. But fortunately, in our residential monitoring network, we had been monitoring one of the wells that's just a few hundred feet to the east for about a period of 8 years. We also had another well about 1.25 miles away that also gave information over that same time period. So these graphs show the water levels that were measured in the basin and in the groundwater. The top one shows the surface water elevation over the past 8 years. The black line shows the rise in groundwater elevations in the nearby well, again over the last 8 years. And the bottom line shows similar rise in water elevations from the well that's a little bit further away. Without this information, we would have really been guessing at the influence of groundwater on the flooding problem. Now that we know that it has played a role, we can more properly design solutions to it. For example, if we had looked at just pumping the water out of the basin, we may have neglected the fact that the basin is going to fill in again with groundwater as we pump out the surface water, and perhaps that's not the best solution to the problem. Another program that we've used in several locations is installing shallow piezometers into groundwater dependent natural resources. Now, by a shallow piezometer, we're just looking at a small diameter metal pipe with slots cut in the bottom of it to allow groundwater to get in. And that's pounded into the lake sediment or the stream sediment using a post pounder. We use water level data recorders both on the outside to measure the water level in the stream or lake, and on the inside of the piezometer to measure the groundwater level within the piezometer. If the water level measured for the groundwater is higher than the water level that's measured for the stream or lake, then we know that there's an upward gradient into the stream or lake, and that groundwater is flowing from groundwater into that stream or lake. By the same token, if the water level in the groundwater is lower than the water level in the stream, we know the water is going out of the stream or lake and back into the groundwater. So this can provide us with some important information. Again, we'll take a look at Browns Creek, where we have installed 7 of these shallow piezometers in the creek bed and monitored them over the summer months. Data that we get from the data recorders looks something like this. On the top, we see the blue line that represents the groundwater level over time, and the brown line, which indicates the water level in the creek. Over the monitoring period, the groundwater was consistently higher than the water level in the creek. So we say that it was a gaining reach. That is, it was gaining groundwater over that time. The gray line on the bottom shows the difference between the two. And actually over this monitoring period, the groundwater continued to flow into the stream, even at a higher rate in the later months than it was in the early months. We can contrast that to a shallow piezometer that was put in a downstream area. Again, we see that the blue line representing the groundwater is consistently higher than the brown line representing the water level in the stream. Until we get into the later months where the groundwater actually falls below the level of the stream, making this actually a losing reach for some of the later months. This was a bit of a surprise, not what we had expected. We had always assumed that because Browns Creek is a cold water trout stream, that there would be groundwater inflows to it throughout the year. Although when we started to look at other monitoring data we had on surface water discharges, it explained why we saw less flow upstream than we did downstream. Previously, we thought that perhaps our instruments were wrong. Later, after getting this information, we realized that that's just part of the natural fluctuation in water levels over the year. And that has important consequences when you're looking at, for example, TMDLs, and you're looking at maintaining trout stream habitat. So other options we have for fieldwork that can be done include permeameters that can measure the volume of inflow and outflow to a stream or lake. Looking at deeper permanent monitoring wells that can provide information near groundwater dependent natural resources. They're more expensive, but they do give excellent information. We can also do groundwater flow tests and calculations, including hydraulic conductivity testing, geophysical testing, or even dye trace testing. One thing that we don't usually recommend is computer modeling. It's only recommended if you're studying a specific issue in your watershed district, and if you have a specific question that you want to use the computer model to answer. Computer models are generally expensive, and if you don't have good information to put into them, you don't get good information out of them. So it's usually better to spend your money on developing the background data that you have that would support a computer model if and when you need to develop one for the watershed district. So in summary, for your next watershed plan, in order to include groundwater resources, you should first identify what is not being done by other agencies in your watershed. That typically includes local monitoring and also long-term monitoring of groundwater. You need to know your groundwater resource. You need to gather previous reports and data, and also do an inventory of the groundwater dependent natural resources in the watershed. Then you can begin low-cost monitoring programs, such as water level measurements or installing shallow piezometers near groundwater dependent natural resources. So with that, I'll take questions. And if you don't have questions now, feel free to reach out to me at the phone number and the email address there on the screen. Thank you very much.